A person's data is much like their election vote. It matters little on its own, but in a cluster of millions, it becomes a precious resource coveted by governments, corporations, and even foreign powers. On one hand, big data sets help improve services and personalize your digital interactions. On the other, they can be tools of political control or commercial exploitation. So, how do we strike a balance between using personal data to improve our environments and protecting it from those who only want improvements for themselves? I'm Tomasz Koper, and this is Connected on TaiwanPlus. To help us understand the challenges related to data privacy, we welcome Max Schrems, an Austrian lawyer, privacy activist, and the founder of the European Center for Digital Rights, also known as NOIB, who is joining us from Vienna. And from Taipei, we have Chou Kuan-Ju, Deputy Secretary General of the Taiwan Association for Human Rights. Max, I want to start with you here. You've been fighting giants in the tech space like Google, Meta, Microsoft for decades now. Why is the cause of data privacy so important to you?
I think for me personally, there is a rule of law issue that comes to it. In Europe, we do have these data protection laws, and we have a lot of, especially the American big tech companies, but also increasingly Chinese companies actually, to just totally ignore these laws that we have. So that's kind of this rule of law element that we have. But if we get back to privacy, I think the really interesting question is if we're moving into an information age, the big question is who has power over that information. It's just like moving into an industrial age. The question is who has power over labor, for example, and what labor laws do we need, for example. So I think we have to talk about privacy more as also a question of informational distribution, who has power over information, and who basically gets the value out of it.
Well, Kuan-Ju, when governments step in and interfere with our digital lives, they often cite protecting our personal data, our digital data, as the reason for that. And Taiwan's government recently announced a ban on the Chinese app Xiaohongshu, or Red Note, due to possible fraud, cybersecurity risks, and the app's failure to comply with regulatory demands. Do Chinese apps really pose a security risk for Taiwan and local users here? And are blanket bans like this one the way to tackle this issue?
I think currently in Taiwan, to talk about this kind of restriction of access to digital platform, and also how to combat fraud and also the China influence is very difficult. But in this Xiaohongshu case, that we can see that the government gave us two reasons of why the government need to ban Xiaohongshu for a year. And the reason are what Tomasz mentioned, is about the cybersecurity, that the National Intelligence Bureau do a security test about 15 elements. And another reason is about in combating fraud crime, that Xiaohongshu did not comply with the data request relating to fraud crimes that Taiwanese government are asking. But I think the problem is that the law that Taiwanese government citing to do the restriction access is according to the fraud crime prevention law. And in the law, it only in the law it did not have judicial review, and it gave the government a very huge power to directly do the restriction of access using the domain name, blocking of domain name. But I think maybe the government should give more information to the public, for example, like what exactly the Xiaohongshu app violates the Personal Data Protection Act in Taiwan. For example, that we see that in the 15 elements of the cybersecurity tests that the National Intelligence Bureau did on these China app, there are many testing items is related to over-collected personal data and also forced consent to us users to give out this kind of personal data. But the government did not listed that which articles these apps violates. So I think if the government can give more precise on how these China apps violating our current personal data protection law, and also in what extent this company are not willing to collaborate with government to combat fraud crimes, and maybe it would be more helpful to let civil society to view about this case and to let the government to meet the principle of proportionality in doing this 1 year access restriction.
Well, Max, a decade ago, you challenged Facebook on the issue of moving personal data of Europeans to U.S. servers, where they could potentially be accessed by U.S. agencies like NSA or FBI. What changes resulted from your action? And is data of Europeans better protected these days than back then?
Basically, no actions resulted from that other than a lot of paperwork. And that is a bit the problem we have in Europe. We do have these laws, but the enforcement of it and serious consequences are not done. So on the case specifically, it was about the NSA under US law having enormous powers to kind of just take data from Google or Microsoft or, all the big tech companies. And the interesting thing that the US does, it basically says that this type of surveillance is unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution, but the Fourth Amendment only protects Americans. So basically they say if your data lands with, let's say, Google or Microsoft, the big question is, are you American or not? If you're American, such type of surveillance is unconstitutional. If you're not American, then basically they can do whatever they want to do. There are certain limitations and some guidelines, but they are very superficial limitations. And that's a huge problem from a European perspective, because most of our IT cloud infrastructure, at least, is right now imported from the US. And so far, the idea was, we're allied and we're partners and we're friends anyways. But especially the last couple of weeks, it became more and more apparent that the US more sees Europe as an enemy than necessarily a friend in all cases. So it increasingly becomes a question of dependence, which is unfortunate. We would generally want to have a rule of law system where we can trust that our data is protected even if it goes abroad, and therefore we can just have international data transfers as we should. But that reality, especially in an increasingly nationalistic approach from the US side especially, becomes more and more problematic. So there is a lot of discussions in Europe about what they call digital sovereignty. I don't necessarily like the word, but the idea of being able that at least your core services are run in your own country so that you're not shut down. To give you a very simple example, I'm now invited a lot to Denmark, and I was wondering about that. And in Denmark, they have this conflict with the US about Greenland. So suddenly the Danish, being like 5 million people, had the worry that, Trump, in some of his erratic craziness moments, is just going to shut down or embargo Denmark over Greenland. And that would mean that they would have to shut down all the Microsoft in school, all the hyperscalers that run their hospitals, and so on. So half of the country would suddenly be shut down. That is not anything that I think is likely tomorrow to happen, but it becomes increasingly a possibility. And even just a 1% possibility in that breadth of consequences is something that people take more seriously now. Unfortunately, I have to stress that. Not anything we like, but it's a reality that we have to face.
So on that note, Max, is this going to become a trend? Because we do see some jurisdictions in some countries move away from U.S. cloud services. Most recently, Schleswig-Holstein, the state in Germany, announced that they will be moving away from cloud services and to open source software. Is this something that we're going to see more of in the future?
I think so far the trend was to dump everything in a US cloud and just not worry about it. Now we see more, I would say, a neutral position where people go both directions, but you see generally the trend towards like really thinking where all your stuff ends up, especially in high security situations where it's, for example, government data. To give an example, in Austria, a lot of this core data was never outsourced. That was always run by government service that the government owned. That's different in Germany. They, for example, oftentimes didn't have that digital infrastructure or that digital know-how in the government sector. So they just gave it to the private sector because they didn't know how to do it themselves. We see now more and more countries moving towards like gradually getting out of the US clouds. But this is a very long process. I mean, building these software infrastructures is oftentimes decades in the making, and then moving out of it may also take decades, but we see a trend that's growing. I think the biggest forefront here is usually France. France has started already before the Trump administration to talk more and more about this digital sovereignty discussion, which again, I'm a bit sometimes worried about the wording, but there we see that trend generally. Where we see a huge U-turn, I think, is the Scandinavian countries. They have been very pro-US, whatever US technology is great. And now suddenly they realize that maybe that's not the best idea. So there we see probably the biggest U-turn, at least in the discussions I witness.
Well, Guanru, even if data does not leave country borders, it can still be controversial. During COVID, the Taiwanese government was planning to work with telecom operators to create a contact tracing system, and that sparked controversy in Taiwan and wasn't a particularly popular decision. Do you think that serious events, serious circumstances like a public health crisis are enough to justify this level of government surveillance? And is the Taiwanese public ready to accept?
I think back to the COVID time that many Taiwanese citizens support for the government's prevention measures about the COVID. But I think when dealing with digital surveillance and especially on location data, it should be very careful. Back then during COVID-19, that the government used telecommunication data to analyze about which kind of people will be high-risk group. And then we know that there is a huge case called Banhua. And in that case is that there are people, they are being, I would say, tagged, but actually that is the government used the telecommunication location data to figure out who might be in high risk and then put an annotation on their national health insurance card. And this kind of annotation that did not notify the patients at the time. And then this method made that some patients are being rejected by the hospital and clinics at that time. And so my suggestion is that we have to discuss how to prevent the function creep that is relating to digital surveillance, even if it is for public health. And also in this time that maybe in Taiwan, we should build the data protection impact assessment first to assess that what kind of risks and what we do for the urgency to use this kind of method. For example, like notified the remedies to these patients that are being annotated, or to use some periodic assessment to decide and what level that this kind of digital surveillance method should that we should abandon it, and also the sunset clause that we should discuss now. But till now that these methods are not being fully discussed and put in our procedure in tackling pandemic.
So again, transparency seems to be at the core of the issue there. Well, Max, the global economy, the globe in general is now gripped by tech rivalry between China and the US, with the bulk of global data being stored in data centers in either of those two countries. You've mentioned that before, how smaller countries are now realizing the situation they're in and trying to make changes. But it's also much more difficult for these smaller players to establish their own ecosystems and keep data on their premises. Is that a trend that we will see into the future that could result in loss of data sovereignty? You said you don't like that term, but control over a country's own data and giving it away to big players, in a way, kind of letting them control access to it.
Yeah, I think we're moving exactly in that direction, and I think that's a big problem that goes beyond just like privacy and so on. I mean, in reality, we had a global internet that was interconnected, that was interoperable. A bit the idea of like websites and email, where you can have 1,000 providers, 1,000 access providers, 1,000 hosting providers, and everybody can talk to each other, and it's a, let's say, free market system as intended. Now, on top of this, like, let's say, open infrastructure that the internet used to be, we now have this walled garden and this closed infrastructure that is gradually built on top of it. Now, that has problems with like control by governments over it. I mean, we have cases, for example, between the Republic of Austria and Microsoft, where the Republic itself says it cannot actually negotiate contracts with Microsoft, even as a country with 9 million inhabitants. You don't have the economic power to actually get a deal that you want. And that means it's even worse for any normal company. And that gets me a bit to the economics of it as well. The reality is that we're having a couple of companies that now suck up a major part of the economic value of services. And that becomes increasingly an economic question as well. It's not anything that I, as a lawyer, actually work on, but obviously, as a citizen, you realize that we now have these, magnificent seven, as they call it, on the U.S. stock market that make enormous profits. And the question arises if that's fair, if that is a type of market that we want, and if we don't just have massive anti-competitive behavior. So I think also from a pure competition perspective, that may be an element where Europe may have to get into. I usually say there is a bit of a different understanding of competition in the US and in Europe. We usually have an understanding of continuous competition. So I can choose from, 50 different internet providers and choose the one I like, and I can switch each month. In the US, or especially in the Silicon Valley, there is more of an idea of a competition during a runoff phase. So basically Uber versus Lyft, and one of them then gets the market and then monopolizes that market and then milks the cow. And that is a different type of competition understanding that we have between Europe and the US. That means the bigger you are, the more likely you are you're going to win. And that also means in this international situation that countries that have a huge home market, China, the US being the prime examples, but probably also India, for example, having a huge home market, will dominate versus countries that do not have that home market to grow a company so big that it can actually, then withstand on the international market. So I think that from a European perspective is an additional element that is not just privacy, fundamental rights, which I'm working on, but also an economic question of who actually gets the profits from all of this.
Well, taking one step down on this size scale and looking at the individual level, what can individuals do to ensure their private data, their personal data is better protected? Europe's GDPR, in theory, guarantees individuals access or the right to know what's collected and how it's used, but does it work in practice?
No, not at all. I think, so first of all, the premises of the question I always try to push back a bit on, because we try to shift the responsibility to individuals, and the industry has done that quite well. It's a bit like, even as an individual, you stop breathing, there's still going to be CO2 emissions. You're not going to be able to actually fix it yourself. So I think it's a societal problem, and we have to approach it from a societal side. Now, the first step is something that Europe has done, is having proper privacy laws, having them theoretically enforceable, and the laws are not perfect, but at least are, I usually say, the least stupid law I know. So that's a starting point. The big problem that Europe has is we're masterclass in developing new fundamental rights and law, but we're very bad at enforcing them. And that is partly cultural because we're used that companies generally follow the law, and the big tech companies do everything but that. They deliberately break the law to make profits. So there's a bit of a cultural problem here that the Europeans are a bit overwhelmed with companies just totally ignoring the law. And then we need proper enforcement and proper pushing through it. And there is a bit of a unholy alliance between a couple of small EU member states, especially Ireland, where all these big tech companies are headquartered because the Irish government is part of the European Union, obviously, but it simply does not enforce European law. So we have a situation where it's a bit of a pocket. In the US, it's similar with Delaware for corporate reasons that these states just don't enforce the law. And that is a bit the problem that we have in Europe, is that we have certain pockets where all these big tech companies are sitting in, where the law is simply not enforced as we have it on paper. So that's the second step that is absolutely missing in Europe.